Welcome to Horde's Dairyman Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, Managing Editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from our Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building, commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde and founder of our magazine. Dairy Livestream episode is made possible thanks to support from our friends at the Journal of Nutrient Management. Our conversation today will focus on the hot topic, cows can be a solution to climate change. This is the third and final episode in a three-part series on sustainability. On July 21st, we aired Sustainability, What Can We Do on the Farm? 2 weeks later, we covered Sustainability, Dairy's Position in the Marketplace on Dairy Livestream. Those webcasts are available on our Horde's Dairyman YouTube channel, and Dairy Livestream is also available as a podcast version on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Search for Dairy Livestream from the convenience of your smartphone. Let's turn our attention to cows can be a solution to climate change. Before we begin this episode, I want everyone to know, all our viewers and listeners out there, that we will not be debating climate change as an overarching topic. It's our collective goal to discuss carbon and methane markets and how dairy farmers can be part of a long-term solution to this situation that's on the minds of many people, especially consumers. Before we hear from Mark Stoermann, let's go to our first poll question. Which renewable fuel standards are available for farms today? Low carbon fuel standard, LCFS. Renewable fuel standard, RFS. All the above or none of the above. So go ahead and enter that, and we will talk about that real shortly with Mark Stoermann. This is an important topic because this is actually the standard that applies to how we pay for and set up these programs. So let's go ahead and cut the poll question off. And 62% of you did say all of the above, making both of the top two answers the correct answers. To open this discussion, we invite Mark Stoermann to Dairy Livestream. Mark has a long and distinguished career throughout agriculture, having spent 9 years as a production and supply chain manager with Rackus Foods, and later he served in a similar role with ConAgra. In 2000, Mark joined Fair Oaks Dairy Farms, where he was responsible for the construction of 3 anaerobic digesters. Those projects included electrical generation, as well as gas cleaning and transportation fuel. In roles with Renewable Dairy Fuels and AMP CNG LLC from 2011 to 2015, Mark helped to develop a fleet of 40-plus trucks that operate on renewable CNG. That's renewable compressed natural gas. This effort included developing fuel stations in the I-65, I-75, and I-10 interstate corridors. After a short stint as COO of Star Bioenergy, Mark became the Chief Operating Officer for Newtrient, which has the mission to reduce the environmental footprint of dairy and make it economically viable to do so. Mark, welcome to Dairy Livestream, and share with us some potential solutions available to dairy farmers in this space.
Thank you, Corey. I really appreciate this opportunity to participate in the Horde's Dairyman Dairy Livestream event, because Newtrient is really passionate about helping dairymen reduce their impact on the environment and understanding the opportunity that exists for them to participate in the generating renewable natural gas, or RNG. One of the real keys to dairies being an ideal candidate for these RNG projects, and the reason we're being approached so often, is because of the double benefit that comes from creating RNG from dairy manure. First, there's the capture of the methane gas that would naturally escape from the dairy manure pit or the lagoon. Most people have heard how methane is more than 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide and tropic heat in the atmosphere, even though it doesn't remain in the atmosphere as long. So by capturing this methane using anaerobic digestion, we prevent it from being released. And that way, it reduces the impact on the climate. Then secondly, once it is captured, it can be used to replace fossil fuels. That can be done in any part of the energy sector that uses renewable natural gas. But the particular emphasis that we're seeing with RNG projects right now, in many cases, is that it's being used in the transportation sector. And that means that the CO2 that would normally come from the fossil fuels that are used in the transportation sector or for fossil natural gas never enters the atmosphere as well. And unlike methane, CO2 stays in the atmosphere hundreds of years. So there are several programs right now that are providing financial incentives to RNG producers, and most of them are geared toward the transportation sector, as I just mentioned. One of them is renewable fuel standards, the RFS, which most people associate with the ethanol industry, but this provides funding for fueling RNG fleets nationwide. It's a federal program. Then there's also low carbon fuel standards that have been adopted in California and Oregon and that are being considered in multiple other states. And these provide additional incentives for the use of RNG in their states in the transportation markets that those states have. Altogether, the incentives right now that are adding value to RNG can be over 30 times the value of 1 million BTUs of gas that you currently could sell. So for example, right now, 1 million BTUs, an MMBTU of gas, is selling for about $3. And as of yesterday, with all of the credits applied, that same million BTUs is worth $96.59. And so not all markets are going to be able to get into the California transportation market that number is based on. But in the long term, as we move into different markets and different opportunities, you're going to see that there's a lot of opportunities to work with utilities and environmentally sensitive gas purchasers and actually get an incentive for producing a renewable product. I'd like to say that it's easy for every dairy to get into this, and that it's easy to produce the product and it's easy to get these projects going. That's just not the case. First of all, because of the way the programs are structured, the price depends on how you manage your dairy, that CI score, if you will. What did you do with your manure beforehand? How much did you emit? And now, how are you going to manage your manure afterwards? Then to actually make the conversion, you need an anaerobic digester. And an anaerobic digester allows natural organisms to create methane gas, but it also creates CO2 and some other contaminants. So that gas has to be upgraded or cleaned. And once it's upgraded and cleaned, it has to be injected into the into the natural gas grid or into the pipeline as renewable natural gas. Once that's done, you still need to be able to contract for the sale with entities that are actually distributing natural gas in the transportation sector in the areas of the country that have LCFS programs. When you start adding all that together, you get some pretty complex programs and projects that you get going here. And then in addition, you get a lot of costs that right now really needs 5,000 to 10,000 cows in one location to justify getting a project going. And so more and more of these projects are looking at distributed systems where we're gathering gas and bringing it together, sometimes in a pipeline situation, sometimes using virtual pipelines. But I'd really like to emphasize that, you know, as many projects as there are out there, there are an infinite number of alternatives. And there are multiple ways that you can approach projects. And I'm just going to give kind of really broad brush examples of how you could do these projects in 3 potentially different ways and what kind of returns and risks a dairy farm might take to get those sort of returns. First of all, you could do what dairy farmers have been traditionally doing with anaerobic digesters, and that's building them themselves, working with engineers and people like that, and then finding people to contract with to work on the project. And they would take all of the risk individually as a farmer, and they would subsequently get all of the rewards. The other option is to combine and work with somebody who's already developing projects and already financially secure and already got the contracts and to participate by contributing some equity and become a partner in the project. Those options are there, and there are companies out there that are very interested in those, and there are other developmental companies that are not as interested in those. Those companies, though, will come to you as a farmer and remove almost all of the risk, giving you the opportunity to have a digester put on your farm in return for a long-term agreement on supplying the feedstock and some sort of participation in the project. So what differences do those make? Well, obviously, based on the risk and based on the reward, you're going to see significant differences in pricing. But the easy way to think of it is this way. One cow produces about 21 MMBTUs a year. You're going to need probably in the neighborhood of 40% of that to cover the cost of the project in the contracts, no matter whether you build it yourself or whether you partner with somebody else. And so that's going to leave you 13 MMBTUs per cow per year to sell. If you partner with a developer and are splitting that cost and you're putting your equity in, you're going to get a larger share of that. If you're just partnering to supply your feedstock and taking very low risk, then you're going to get a much smaller amount of that return. I think the important thing to remember is that there are a lot of good projects that don't happen because people don't consider the other partners and make sure it's fair for everyone. And I think the key in these sort of projects, the key takeaway is you need to find something that's going to work for you as a dairy and work with those people that you're comfortable with in a way that is around good communication and that you both value the participation and the expertise of the other entities that are getting this project done. And so I know there'll be a lot of other questions, and I know we have more speakers, so I'm going to turn it back to you, Corey, and then hopefully help answer questions later on.
Thank you, Mark Stoermann. Mark Stephenson, I can't help but think when listening to Mark on this matter that digesters, this conversation on the business model is has a lot of similarities to someone who wants to become process their own milk into dairy products. There's a lot of similarities there. Do you have the talent on your team at the farm to do that? Or do you want to have someone else do that, i.e. sell it to a co-op or a proprietary plant? And those are kind of decisions that people have to make. A quick couple comments on that, Mark Stephenson, before we turn over to Richard Cooper.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, this can be a dilution of management talent on a farm, or as happened for Mark Stoermann at Fair Oaks, we simply hired the person in that we needed to have there. And this is something that can be done on farms as well. I think it depends on both the horsepower that you have and the amount of risk, as Mark indicated, you're willing to bear. So if you're willing to bear some risk and build a project and look for the venues for sale of the gas, then that's something you might want to chew on your own. But most farms, I think, are pretty well consumed with the production of crops and milk. So taking on one more big thing may not be in your wheelhouse.
Thank you, Mark Stephenson. We're going to go straight to another poll question before we hear from Richard Cooper. The question reads like this. At this moment, how many states have low carbon fuel standard programs, LCFS? That's a new acronym to our industry. 2, 4, 8, or 16 are your options. And we'll give everybody about 10 more seconds to go ahead and answer that question. And we're really pleased to have Richard on the program as well. He's one of the many, he represents one of the many companies that are operating in this space and could be a potential partner. So let's go ahead and cut that whole question off. And the answers are all over the board, which until yesterday, I would have had that issue too, but in our dress rehearsal, I learned the answer is 2, California and Oregon. And the next that may be on that list is Washington State. So with degrees in engineering from the University of Michigan and Stanford, Richard Cooper started his career as a consulting engineer in Chicago and then spent 2 years as a water engineer with the Peace Corps in Nepal. Richard then completed his MBA at Harvard Business School and joined Bechtel Enterprises in Singapore, developing infrastructure projects. Since 2001, Richard has served as Business Development Director for DTE Energy, which is one of the for-profit companies that builds, owns, and operates digesters. DTE Energy has developed and is operating 7 renewable gas projects. That's RNG is the acronym for there, but renewable gas projects on dairies and 11 dairies in Wisconsin. DTE's largest dairy RNG project is under construction near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The company delivers dairy RNG both by truck and by pipeline. That's the 2 ways you can really move these gases around. Richard, many dairy farmers have questions about digesters. What can you share with our listeners?
Sure. Thanks, Corey. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, it's an exciting time in the RNG business. There's a tremendous amount happening, and I want to build on some of the things Mark Stoermann said. And before I do that, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to give you just 45 seconds or so on DT Energy, just to level set a little bit. DT Energy is a Fortune 500 company. We are the biggest portions of the company are an electric utility, which used to be called Detroit Edison, if that gives you a sense for what we do. And we have a regulated gas company. But we also have some non-utility businesses too, principally. One is a trading shop. We're not a big bank or something, but we trade electricity and natural gas and environmental commodities, which have historically been pretty important in the utility business. And then we have my group, which invests in energy assets. And that's where we get to these digester projects. You know, we started about the mid-90s or so developing what were called landfill gas projects. Landfills generate methane as the garbage decomposes in the absence of oxygen, and our projects would suck up that gas, clean it up, and use it to either generate electricity, or sometimes industrial customers would use it. And once in a while, if the project was suitable, we'd actually inject it into a pipeline. And so it was a small step from that into dairy digesters. I'll leave it to the group to decide if going from garbage to manure is a step up or a step down, but that's where we find ourselves. We're long-term investors in the space. You know, we're buy and hold people. There's no exit strategy here. We like the business. We're looking for long-term partners. You know, and we want to align with the farmers. We understand. Look, we're the tail wagging the dog here. The farmers involved here need to run their dairy business, and we try to just not get in the way and add as much value as we can in the areas where we can't think we can add value or they see value. So. As you mentioned, you know, all of our operating sites today are in Wisconsin. We've got one under construction in South Dakota. And, you know, and I think that's just an accident of history. We're a Midwestern focused company. And so we started in Wisconsin, and it kind of built from there. We've looked all over the country for these deals, and I think they can work all over the country, but we'll see. We've got our biggest is under construction south of Sioux Falls. And we got capital approval to spend some money in upstate New York. So we'll have that one online soon, I hope. And now getting to the point here. So all of these projects sell the renewable natural gas. That's the product gas, if you will. So I think Mark laid this out, but you know, from a digester, you get what we call raw biogas. It's about half methane, a little bit more maybe, and some CO2 and some sulfur. And we run that through an upgrading facility that can be a variety of different technologies, but essentially we clean it up so it's almost pure methane. And it meets the standards of the interstate pipeline system, which is where you're ultimately trying to get this material. But all of this material ends up in as a transportation fuel. And doing so helps you qualify for some of the effectively subsidies that are out there. So if you sell this as transportation fuel anywhere in the United States, that helps conventional producers of gas and diesel meet their requirements under something called the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is a federal law that's been in place for a long time. And I think Mark hit this. This is the same law. These are the same regs that have really created the ethanol business in the United States. Now, this gas falls in a different category. It's more valuable, but it is the same program that the ethanol folks get, and it is a subsidy. And you get that wherever you sell this material. Now, all of our dairy projects sell into the California transportation market. So this is going into, buses that run on compressed natural gas. This is going into garbage trucks that pick up the waste. I think we have some forklifts, for example, but any of these transportation users can allow this thing to qualify under the California low carbon fuel standard. And similar to the federal program, this is a standard in the state of California, now in Oregon, and we expect it to be in Washington, as Corey mentioned. People who produce gas and diesel in California are required to produce it at a certain carbon intensity. That's a sort of a life cycle analysis of the carbon intensity. And conventional gas and diesel can't meet that standard, so they have to blend in some sort of renewable fuels. And they get a little bang for their buck if they use ethanol, or a little more bang maybe if they use renewable diesel, from waste oils or something. But they get a big bang if they can use dairy gas. Dairy gas, I think it's been mentioned, can have a very low carbon intensity score, below 0, which implies that using the dairy gas isn't just low carbon intensity, it actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And that always seems strange to me. You're combusting the stuff in a natural gas engine, so how can that be? But it's principally because these projects are deemed to capture a bunch of methane that would have otherwise been emitted from a manure lagoon, for example. And that methane capture is really the value. So, we call these renewable natural gas, but I think they should be called methane mitigation projects. That's about where the economics line up. And the last point there I want to make is, so because of that, the viability of a project at any given farm can often depend as much on as much on the manure management practices of the farm as they do on the head count. So both those things are quite important. And that's it. I appreciate the chance to be here, and I look forward to more discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. We're going to go straight to another poll question here. And the poll question is this: how many digesters are processing dairy manure in the United States? So the answers are 221 and 50 under construction, 421 and 100 under construction, 621 and 150 under construction, or 821 and 200 under construction. And I want to give a shout out to Jamie Vandermole, and usually my coworker Caitlin and I are coming up with the poll questions. She was great help here and provided some of these. And I'm going to talk just a little longer while you're answering that, because one of the questions that came in from our listeners here is, do we have a list or map of all the dairy digesters across the United States? And I'll tell you this: if you type into your web browser, list of digesters in the United States, a website will come up that says livestock anaerobic digester database. And we're going to cut the poll question off so that nobody cheats on that one. And there you would find out that the correct answer is 221 operating and 50 under construction. So it would have been the top choice there. And so that gives you a little bit of background of where we're at in this space. We're learning and growing by leaps and bounds here right now. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Danielle Goodrich Gingras to Dairy Livestream. Goodrich Family Farm hosts one of those 221 operating digesters in the United States. In fact, the Goodrich digester is the Northeast United States largest anaerobic digester, and it is a project made possible through a partnership between Vanguard Renewables, Middlebury College, VGS, and of course, the Goodrich Farm. Danielle and her brother Chase are the owners and operators of the Goodrich Family Farm in Salisbury, Vermont. They're near Lake Champlain, if people are familiar with that region. Danielle and her brother Chase grew up watching their father Ernie lead operations on the farm and took over when he retired, or like most farmers, semi-retired, I'm guessing. Danielle and Chase balanced responsibilities, including farming their 1,750 acres of hay and 650 acres of corn, as well as herd management and milking their 900 cows. The Goodrich family is a multi-generational Vermont dairy and a 2021 winner of a U.S. Dairy Sustainability Award from the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. Danielle, as a dairy producer, share with us how your digester is changing the way you farm and even changing or reducing your fertilizer costs.
Sure. Thanks, Corey. So Chase and I came back to the farm in 2009. I think everyone understands that 2009 was a very trying year. So as soon as we came back, we knew we needed to come up with some long-term goals that were going to make us, viable and sustain our farm for years to come. We knew that we always wanted to be a valued member of our community by helping supply high quality and nutritional dairy products, along with also having a positive impact on our environment and local watersheds. I just finished at Vermont Tech when getting a degree in dairy management, and I had a professor there that had been in talks with a developer on an idea to heat Middlebury College through natural gas. My professor immediately thought of my family. He thought we'd be a good fit, being that, we had a great location. We were 7 miles away from Middlebury College. There was hopes because Chase and I were young, coming right from college, we would be innovative and open to new ideas, which we absolutely were. Although at the beginning of the conversation, we obviously, had some doubts. There was definitely some risk in taking this leap. We were completely out of our element, and we knew it was going to be a long construction and permitting process. And we knew that we would have to continue to mold our farm around this project, the digester project, no matter how long this took. But as soon as we started having these conversations, we knew that we were part of something special. I think, Mark Stoermann said earlier that you have to work with people that you're comfortable with. And I think that as soon as we started these conversations with Vermont Gas and Vanguard and Middlebury College, we were comfortable, we were confident with our partners. And, when we got in the same room, it was a tremendously beneficial partnership that started to develop with, lasting benefits on our farm, the community, and the environment. So I think that was really important with us, is that we knew that we were, we respected and trusted our partners. Recently, Neil Lunderville, the CEO of Vermont Gas, said that homegrown energy is made in coveralls and mud cake boots. And I think as a farmer standpoint, working with someone that understood us that well and was also willing to get his boots a little dirty, we knew that we were working with the right people and that this was a right fit. So we were extremely excited to embark on this journey that was so environmentally beneficial but allowed us to do what we came home to do, which was, work with our family and care for our cows and land. We realized that it was a dream team, and when all of us worked together, we accomplished something that none of us individually could have done. It's expensive to do a project of this size, and as farmers, and especially in 2009, there was no way that we could have made this possible on our own, and we knew that. But it was important to us that all of our visions and goals lined up, which it all seemed to do. We realized that we all were trying to accomplish something bigger than just ourselves. We wanted to work on tackling climate change, and we knew the best place to start was right at the community level and using things that we had an abundance of, which was waste. But of course, at times it was, especially in the beginning, it was quite overwhelming and daunting for me, especially. I'd worked with cows my whole life, so I could tell you when a cow wasn't ruminating well, but to, understand how the phosphorus removal system works, or, some of the logistical stuff of the methane digester, it went over my head so fast that, it was a little bit overwhelming, but it made me extremely grateful and lucky that my part in this project was to continue to do what I did best, and that was take care of my cows and just make sure that I was continuing to provide manure for the project. And so for me, that was easy enough because we had an abundance of manure. With the digesters, we're now able to fertilize our lands with low carbon, low odor organic fertilizer and move away from purchasing commercial fertilizer, which was a huge savings for the farm. It also started working towards some of our goals on water quality. We have the phosphorus removal system, and with the digestate, we're able to better precisely spread on our land. And we know that that's we're making steps to better our community by doing so. We're excited when we get to work with our nutrient management team and have discussions on what fields require more digestate and fertilizers that don't. So we're really able to spread more scientifically and with more purpose on what the land needs. We're also to keep things like phosphorus out of sensitive watershed areas, knowing that we're contributing to cleaner water for the next generation is extremely humbling. I've said a few times that I'm excited and happy to know that I'm working on a project that is going to allow my nieces and nephews to have cleaner water to drink and places to swim, as we're in so many watershed areas, being near Lake Champlain and Otter Creek. But we're very fortunate to have a digester that puts in food waste that would typically end up in a landfill, and 100% of our cow's manure, and have its output be renewable gas and liquid, the great low carbon fertilizer for our fields. The digester produces more than 80,000 tons of low carbon, low odor organic digestate annually, which saves the farm about $200,000 a year in commercial chemical fertilizers. My favorite part of the project is the bedding, the separated solids that come from our manure. I love seeing our cows get comfy and cozy in their fresh bedded stalls that we're able to do. We do it 3 times a week, but if we see that we've gone through it quicker, we can add more bedding. It's readily available. We're saving about $50,000 a year just on bedding, where we don't have to buy sawdust, wait for a sawdust truck, make sure that we're not using too much or too little for keeping things in check. So for me, the bedding and just the knowing that I'm providing my cows with quality comfort, but also, it's clean. We have great somatic cells, so that it helps contribute to quality milk. Vanguard kept pushing and still does, pushing the mindset that waste was just a mindset. And I think that really stuck with our farm, and I think it's what really drives this project. So we took a position of wanting to be better and be the best stewards of the land as possible, and this digester allows us to do that. Looking back, it seems like it's taken a long time to get to this point, but I wouldn't change the process in any form. It's been a long battle, but I think as dairy farmers, that's something that we're good at. We don't give up, and we are tenacious and driven to get things that we want done. And my family has done that, and doing so, we've bettered our farm and our community greatly. I think if anyone asked me about any advice on a project like this, I would tell them to be patient, know your goals, know your long-term vision for your farm, and make sure that the people that you're working with have the same vision, have the same goals, and that you guys have great communication and are able to work out some of the smaller quirks early on. And if you guys realize and understand that this project or tackling climate change is more important and bigger than small conversations or small arguments in trying to get there, just understand that what you're doing is bigger than any squabble you could have to get there.
Thank you, Danielle. And our dairy industry is on a continual journey here. And in listening to you, Danielle, I just leap back to a time in my youth, actually 35 years ago, when my dad was one of the first in Wisconsin he assembled a team. They came to him, how would that work? But you built a team that you could trust. And then he put in a manure system back in 1986, and that came with a nutrient management plan and improved the water quality. We were a farm near karst topography and some lakes, so we got a double bonus there. They say that.
Nice.
And But then the other thing, we better able used our nutrients on our and reduced our fertilizers. And what your journey you're on is the next step in that continuum. We got one more poll question before we hear from Mark Stephenson. And the poll question is this. We've heard this word a couple times during the webcast, co-digestate. What is it? What is co-digestate in relationship to generating biogas, spreadable fertilizer, non-organic substances, food waste or other organics, all the above or none of the above? So Danielle used that term, and go ahead and enter your answer. And while you're doing that, we'll do one more quick call for questions. We've answered a couple of them as we've gone along here, but we got some others waiting in the wings after we hear from Mark. So let's go ahead and cut this poll question off. And the correct answer here, as we learn more on this journey, is actually food waste or other organics. And the all the above isn't true because an non-organic substance really can't be broken down here, you know. So let's turn to Mark Stephenson. Mark, this is one of the newest areas for a dairy farm's business portfolio. The renewable fuel standards and low carbon fuel standards are creating incentives for even more dairy farmers to enter this space. As an economist and a longtime contributor to DairyLivestream, who has studied this topic in some detail, what are your thoughts, Mark?
Well, you know, I'm going to be happy to offer just a couple of observations, Corey, and I'm going to get through this quickly because I think we want to get to questions. But my data actually differs just a little bit from you, the poll question that you had earlier, but they're both certainly in the ballpark. By my numbers, there are actually about 330 digesters in the country, and about 233 of those are on dairy farms. The rest of them are either servicing pigs or poultry. Most of the digesters are cogenerative units, and they produce heat to maintain those internal temperatures for the microbes. Several of them are burning excess gas to power generators for electric use. But the problem there is that dairy farm will be surplus of the electric needs with those generators, and the rest of the gas will either have to be flared off or it'll be sold back to the electric grid. And the electric grid's not a big fan of this, even though it's 24/7 green power, and it's not at the whim of sunlight or wind like you know, other sources of green energy might be. But from the utilities perspective, you're pushing all of the balancing costs back to the grid, and they are not big fans of having to do that. That's expensive electricity for them to generate. If you scrub the methane and bring it up to natural gas standards, as both Mark and Richard talked about, then you might be able to sell that to the pipeline. The advantage here is that the balancing doesn't have to take place by bringing systems on and off like you do with the electrical grid as demand changes. And there currently are about 100 digesters that are generating biogas from almost 200,000 dairy cows in this country right now. The total biogas that's generated is roughly 25 million cubic feet of gas per day. And if all of that made it to the pipeline, I should have probably put this in terms of the road miles or number of cars it could push, but if all of that gas made it to the pipeline, it would be enough to supply about 150,000 homes with all their natural gas needs. But, you know, when you think about it, 200,000 cows whose biogas we're capturing is only about 2% of the dairy cows in this country. Obviously, we'll never get to 100%, but I think there's room for a lot more digesters and a lot more opportunity to think about this biogas in the pipeline. And as Richard pointed out, you know, it's a methane mitigation tool at one level, and it is an energy source at another.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to go straight to questions here. And one of the questions, we're going to try to knit these together. My cohort, Caitlin, and I are sorting through them. And some of this involves nutrition. Some of this involves genetics. Some of this involves capturing methane and mitigating it. But the question that comes in to us from one of our viewers, how does improved feed efficiency, the extent of digestion, affect digester operation and economic viability? So this is kind of a big question here we're talking about, but first I'd start out, and I'm going to probably throw that to Mark Stoermann first. Now, we can improve this whole area by genetics, but it's a small part of the thing. Then feed efficiency is a little bit more, and then capturing these gases is a bigger part of the pie. At least that's been my viewpoint, Mark Stoermann.
Yeah, you're correct. Every dairy is unique, and the higher the quality feed, the more the cow is going to be able to extract out of it. But the bacteria that exist in an anaerobic digester are really similar to the bacteria in the rumen. And so it's as if you have a rumen that can hold food for 21 days. So obviously, the food you feed your cow, no matter how high a quality, is going to pass through in a much quicker time period. And there's going to be some material that's left that can be used by those same bacteria in the digester to produce gas. So what we see typically is in the summer, cows eat a little less and they produce a little less milk and they're under a little more stress. The digesters produce a little less gas. And in the fall and winter, when they're eating more and they're taking in a lot of material and they're producing more manure, the digesters produce a little bit more. So there is a relationship between the ration and the genetics, but ultimately, as long as that cow is producing manure, there will be an opportunity to take that manure, continue to break down the carbon in it, and anaerobic digesters really ultimately just break down the carbon source and convert it to methane and CO2. The nutrients remain in the digestate that can then be used for fertilizer, like Danielle and her at Goodrich farms do. So there's always that opportunity also to bring other co-digestates in. So you're correct that they can make differences, but there's still ample energy in that manure to go ahead and produce renewable natural gas.
Richard, anything to add in that area real shortly?
Not really, other than I'll say that, the energy content of the manure is less than the food waste projects you see. So I don't know how much value there is to try to amp up the manure or amp up the energy content of the manure. The economics are much more about capturing that methane. So, we wouldn't want to move the farmer away from what they thought was optimal from a dairying perspective. The manure is the tail wagging the dog here. Maybe that's the tail wagging the cow is the better analogy. But, yeah.
We'll take that pun. Danielle, have you any additional learnings in this area on your farm?
No, I haven't. I mean, we've talked about, cows need to eat to produce manure. So the more their dry matter intake is, it benefits us all around for, we're providing more manure, but, cows that are eating more, producing more milk, they're healthier cows. And for us, the most important part is that we have healthy, happy cows.
So we have a bunch of questions that have rolled in here that I'm just going to say cows, cows, cows. So being playful on this. And everybody might have a little bit of different answer here because as we did in dress rehearsal, Mark Stephenson shared that in Europe there's farms with fewer cows or smaller farms with digesters. But the question basically is this: what size of farm, number of cows is required to make manure digesters economically viable? So we have a system here. What Danielle's got 900 cows, but they're getting some co-digestate and food in there. But we're going to go through, we're going to start with Mark Stoermann, Richard Cooper, and then finish with Mark Stephenson on this one real brief, about 30 seconds or less on each one. Mark Stoermann.
It really depends on your market. So in Danielle's state, they actually have a program that for very small farms gives them a very high price for the manure. And so there are actually digesters in Vermont that are operating on 250 cows. So depending on the market incentives, you can get very small digesters that can be profitable. But for RNG, because the costs are so high to connect to the utilities and the interconnects, those tend to favor the larger farms. Richard, your experiences?
Sure. I want to echo what Mark said. And I said in the opening remarks, that the challenge here is both the number of cows and the manure management practices, because so much of the economics depend on how much methane the state of California believes you're mitigating. So we've seen, for example, and we only do manure projects. I think there are, with food waste co-digestion, and I think Vanguard's got a great record. Those folks, you can use a smaller farm because the economics are quite different. But for manure only, we look at farms with as little as, say, 1,500 cows. I think we've seen work if they have really good methane characteristics. On the other hand, we saw a farm that was just shy of 8,000 milkers. So it was more, head size was more than that, herd size was more than that. And that didn't work simply because they were separating all their solids. There was relatively little organic material being put in their lagoons, and it didn't work. So I give you that big range. I'm not trying to be cagey. It really is, these are odd commodity markets. They are carbon mitigation markets. The California market's very well established. It's probably the most liquid and largest carbon market in the world. I think the Europeans trade a lot, but it's not quite as, I don't think it's as well established. But it's, it's not it's not an obvious or easy to understand market. You really have to understand the characteristics of the farm and what the life cycle carbon or greenhouse gas emissions are.
Mark Stephenson, any learnings from your travels in Europe that you'd like to add?
Well, I think there can be multiple goals that people have for digesters. Certainly, producing an RNG might be one of them, but I know some farms that would say, I need it because I'm close to population, and just helping to mitigate the smell, the odors from the farm is a big plus for my neighbors. I know other folks like Danielle who would say that, it's a big plus to be able to use the process, A, for bedding, that we're pulling some of those solids out ahead of time. And the other would be that, B, we need to be careful of waterways, or we have a fractious soil and we need to pull some phosphorus out of our manure. And so this is part of the process. The gas may be just a bonus on top of that. So, farms in Germany may only be a couple hundred cows. They've got a small digester. They're capturing gas, but they've got really big programs that the government is using for taxpayers to subsidize, green energies. And there they may be dumping corn silage straight into, the digester as part of the feedstock. It's not just manure.
So, Danielle, a number of our viewers, most of them dairy farmers, are asking, obviously there must have been some kind of contract here, and they're kind of, the question they want to know is, do you have a contract, and how long might that be?
Oh, we do have a contract. We have a 20-year contract.
Okay. And as a follow-up, as a person who's updating his will, my wife and I, did you work with an attorney to look that over? Did you seek some outside advice in that area?
Absolutely. Our farm has a great relationship with our attorney that's local, and any document or contract that would come onto the farm would definitely be looked at by him. Like I said, we all have our roles, so when it comes to contracts, we use our attorney to to do that role so that we can still focus on what we do best, and that's take care of our cows and get the advice from our attorney on whether what we're doing is a good idea or not.
Mark, in your experience, is that what is a contract length? Is 20 kind of a standard or ballpark, or what range might you see?
It really depends. It really depends on the project. But Danielle touched on a really, really great point, and that is get expertise where you need it. And then the other thing is, it's going to be a long-term relationship because these are 20-year projects. So sometimes the gas contract only go 5 years, but whether you're in a partnership, whether you build it yourself, whether you're just in a feedstock agreement, you are in a long-term relationship here. And so you need to be ready to have really serious conversations about things like succession planning, about what happens if we have to stop milking cows. How are we going to, those are conversations to have and get those things contracted before we run into a situation that 5 years down the road, nobody considered. Do as much of that upfront work as you possibly can so that the relationship is spelled out and the process for dealing with difficulties, because all projects run into difficulties, are already defined upfront.
We're going to go. Go ahead, Danielle.
I think also I just wanted to comment, on the 20-year, it seems less daunting at the time. We were 24. I was 24. My brother was, 26 when these conversations started happening. So, 20 years, I'm 33 now. So even 20 years from now, my hope and plan is to, 20, 30, 40 years to still be here farming. So it still seems less daunting than I think it may to my father, who's, 66, but.
We're going to go to a speed round here. I'm going to get the throttle up here to try to clear the deck of questions. So I'm going to point those to one person on the panel. If anyone wants to jump in, they're going to need to do it quick. Next one is going to go to Richard Cooper. This comes from a longtime listener and a dairy farmer. And he says, we currently have sand-bedded systems with mechanical separation. Do you have experience converting from sand to solids from the digesters? Is that a natural transition? So a guy who uses sand bedding.
Yeah, no, you can make either work. So we have sites where farmers want sand bedding, feel most comfortable with sand bedding, and we want to put in a sand separation system. You don't want sand in your digester. It just costs a lot more actually than removing it. We have farmers who experiment with the bedding coming out of the digester. They haven't used it before and they convert over. It's a cost thing. Separating the sand costs money, and the farmer will all get less money if we have to spend that. But if that's what it takes to get the deal done, that gets done sometimes. Mm-hmm. We're doing that in South Dakota.
We're going to send this one to Mark Stoermann. What is a typical investment in this area? Like, how much does a project of this cost? And give a range, maybe.
That's tough because all projects are different, and what I would tell you is that depending on the project, depending on where it is, depending on how close the interconnect is, depending on how you do the transportation of the gas, I tell people that the cost of the digester project is almost the same cost as the dairy it sits beside, and I think that's a pretty good number. So if you have a 3,500 to 5,000 cow dairy that costs $15 to $20 million, you should expect to have a $15 to $20 million digester project that would tie into a pipeline. And again, if you're in some place where you're 70 miles from the pipeline, it may cost more because you need more transportation, you need more issues. If you're sitting right on top of a pipeline, if you're already bedding on an organic material, so that you can convert easily to solids for bedding, then your project may be a little less expensive.
Yeah, you're really building, this is a whole separate business here. It'd be no different. I think that analogy, Mark Stoermann, is really good because if you were to put up a dairy processing plant on your farm, you probably, Mark Stephenson, you might consider using the same analogy there, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would. I mean, they're completely different businesses.
I'm going to try to interpret this question here because I think I know what the viewer's trying to ask here, and we're going to make a little edits here. And Mark Stephenson, I'm going to send this to you here, and if anyone wants to jump in, they can do so. The person says it seems odd there's such a large push for beneficial electrification, but interest in electric from digesters is a little bit lower. So what I'm going to edit that to say is I think what she's asking is there's more push for the gas component of this versus electricity, and that's probably driven by the fact that we can move the gas a little bit more easily, and the demand can be met by putting it in a pipeline or moving it by trucks. So really talk about the difference here, why it seems that compressed natural gases in a renewable format are becoming more in favor than opposed to electricity.
Electricity is instantaneous. If you generate it and you put it on the grid, it's there. It's going to be used somewhere, and whatever you're adding, if it's surplus to what the grid needs at that moment, it's got to be taken off somewhere else. Likewise, if you're short, you have to put it on. So that's one of the issues. A pipeline is almost a ballast in and of itself. It can handle a little bit more injection and balancing. So I think that's one of the reasons gas is looking to be a bit more in favor. The other thing is that the generators for generating electricity, the big engines and stuff, are just expensive, and the amount that you're receiving for surplus electricity may hardly pay to change the oil in those big diesel or those big natural gas units.
Richard, go ahead.
I'd add one thing to what Mark said. I think what Mark said is right on. But the thing I would add too is today, while there are a few dairies that are capturing LCFS credits through electricity sales, what we call the electricity pathway, it's pretty onerous. You have to deliver that electricity. You have to have what's called firm delivery into California. So if you're not in Idaho or Nevada or Utah, you're going to have a tough time just getting LCFS credits. And as of today, there are no RINs, or these renewable fuel benefits, available for electricity sales. Now, the EPA, the EPA has made announcements just in the last few days that they are trying to put out rules or regulations around what are called e-RINs, so electricity sales could get this. And I won't be surprised if that happens. You might see more of these projects producing electricity because, although Mark said it's right about generators, it's cheaper to produce that electricity than it is to produce the gas.
We're going to go to 30 seconds or less and try to.
I will offer just one less than 30-second comment, and that is electricity can be produced by windmills and solar panels as well. And so those have really driven the price of renewable electricity down to the point where now generating it from cow manure is actually more expensive than buying it from a solar panel.
So 30 seconds or less on these, so I'm going to pick one person, and Richard, you're getting the first one. I think you might have answered this question partially here. What's the best strategy for RNG when there is no local network, i.e. a pipeline delivery system? Go.
You can try to truck it, but there's economic limitations on trucking too. If you're, more than 50 miles from a natural gas pipeline, you're going to have a tough time doing these deals unless the electricity pathway comes around.
Mark Stoermann, you're on the clock. What makes the biggest difference for having a good methane profile in regarding methane here in term? I think we've used that word a number of times.
CI score is really driven by whether or not you're storing a lot of manure in a liquid state that goes anaerobic. So if you have pits or you have lagoons, you emit a lot more methane, and your methane score goes lower when you put a project in. If you're on a dry lot where manure dries out very quickly, your score is not going to be nearly as low.
I'm going to send a final question back to you, and hopefully you can answer it, and we'll clear the deck here of all the questions. There was a renewable so this comes from a dairyman in Arizona who's just up on this topic. There was a renewable electrical generation project in Arizona that used substances that were cleaned out of the forest floors to reduce wildlife risk. Is there a similar process? Is that a similar process as a methane digester? So they're using wood substrate, really.
I think what they probably use there is pyrolysis and gasification, where you're producing a syngas. It can be done on manure solids, but you need to dry the solids first. So there are gasification systems, and so potentially out west where you would collect a lot of dry lot manure, you might be able to use those sort of processes. But at this point in time, the cost of those projects are not really, there aren't really markets that help offset those.
Well, thank you. We're approaching the top of the hour here. Our next dairy live stream will focus on export potential and specifically chatter on the cheese markets. This conversation will focus on dairy's quickly growing role in cheese and dairy exports. The show will air Wednesday, September 15th, 2021 at 11 a.m. Central Daylight Time. It will be archived on the Hordes Dairyman YouTube and podcast channels the very next day. We look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Mark Stoermann, Richard Cooper, Danielle, Goodrich, Gingras, and Mark Stephenson, I'm Corey Geiger, your host. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good day, everyone.